Margaret sat very still, as if bracing herself against the weight of years. The rain had stopped by the time Emma returned to Willow Hill, but the air still held that heavy, quiet dampness that comes after a storm, the kind that makes every sound feel louder. Margaret's window was open a crack. The curtains fluttered softly. On the small table between them sat 2 cups of tea, steam rising and curling into the silence. "You came back," Margaret said quietly. "I had to," Emma replied. "You said I needed to know the truth." Margaret nodded, folding her hands together. "Then you'd better listen carefully. My mother's story isn't a tragedy. Not exactly. It's what happens when a woman learns too late that silence can be its own kind of prison. She married Robert because it was expected," Margaret began. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, the kind that comes from telling the same story for too long. Her parents adored him, wealthy, respectable, a man with prospects. They thought Daniel was a distraction, an artist with no future. My grandfather told her if she didn't marry Robert, she'd be cut off. Emma felt a hollow ache in her chest. The story already felt too familiar. "So she did what she was told," Margaret continued. "She smiled, wore the dress, said the vows. Everyone said it was a beautiful wedding. Everyone but her." She looked down at her hands. "I was born a year later. By then, she'd already learned how to disappear in plain sight." Margaret's voice grew quieter, steadier, like a current pulling them backward in time. "Robert wasn't cruel. That was the worst part. He was kind, polite, gentle, everything a husband was supposed to be. But he was a stranger. Their marriage was like a well-furnished house where no one ever spoke above a whisper." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "They threw parties, smiled for photographs, hosted dinners. People used to say they were the perfect couple. But when the guests went home, I'd see her sitting by the window, staring out at the garden like she was waiting for someone who'd forgotten her address." Emma thought of her own reflection in the mirror that morning, the faint weariness behind her smile. The parallels made her stomach twist. Margaret went on. "She painted sometimes, after I went to bed. Little sketches she'd hide in drawers, faces, landscapes, sometimes just her hands. I think she was trying to remember what it felt like to create. To feel something that was hers alone." "Did she ever talk about Daniel?" Emma asked softly. "Only once." Margaret's gaze went distant. "I must have been 16. I found one of his sketches in her jewelry box, a drawing of her face, half-finished. When I asked who it was, she told me he'd been her teacher. But the way she said it," Margaret shook her head. "You don't mourn a teacher for 20 years. Emma's chest tightened. "How did she die?" Margaret exhaled slowly. "Cancer. Ovarian. She was 47. By the time they found it, it was too late." She paused. "In the last weeks, she asked for forgiveness, not from me, not even from my father. From herself. She said she'd spent her whole life being the woman everyone wanted her to be. And when she finally tried to find her own voice, it was too late to use it." Silence filled the room, soft, unbearable. Emma's eyes burned. "Did she ever mention the letter?" Margaret nodded. "She told me once she'd written something for me, years ago, before I was born. A letter for my wedding day. She said she'd hidden it in the dress, said maybe one day it would find the right person." "She meant me," Emma whispered. Margaret smiled faintly. "Or maybe she meant anyone who needed it. My mother was always reaching for someone she'd never meet." For a while, neither spoke. The tea had gone cold. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the clouds in pale gold. "She stayed married until the end," Emma said quietly. "Even though she was unhappy." "She stayed," Margaret agreed, "because that's what women did then. You didn't walk away. You smiled, you endured, you told yourself it was love because everyone said it should be." Emma thought of James, of the dinners, the calm, the polite affection that sometimes felt more like a habit than a heartbeat. "She used to tell me," Margaret added softly, "don't mistake comfort for joy." I didn't understand what she meant until I was too old to change it myself. Emma looked up. "You married young too." Yes. To a man my father approved of. Margaret's expression turned rueful. History repeats itself, unless someone's brave enough to break it. Emma reached for the letter lying on the table between them. The edges had begun to fray from being handled so often. She wanted you to read it, Margaret said. Not for the past, for yourself. Emma nodded, her throat tight. I think I already have. Margaret smiled sadly. Then maybe it's time to decide what comes next. Emma gathered her things, preparing to leave. Margaret walked her to the door, moving slowly but with purpose. As Emma stepped into the hallway, Margaret called after her. Emma? She turned. Be careful with that dress, Margaret said softly. It's not just fabric. It carries the choices of every woman who's worn it. Emma nodded. I understand. But Margaret didn't smile this time. I hope you do. Emma hesitated. Will you be all right? Margaret gave a small nod. I've made my peace. It's you I'm worried about. Emma blinked. Me? Margaret's gaze sharpened, old eyes seeing more than they should. Because if you're not careful, you'll make the same mistake she did. A chill crept over Emma's skin. Before she could reply, Margaret closed the door gently, the sound echoing down the quiet hall. Emma stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, Catherine's letter pressed to her chest. When she finally turned to leave, her phone buzzed again, a message from James. I'm outside. Her pulse spiked. She glanced toward the glass entrance doors. Through the rain-smeared light, she could just make out his silhouette waiting by the car, still unreadable. She didn't know if he was there to take her home, or to make sure she never came back. The rain hadn't stopped, though it had softened into something quieter, more like a whisper than a storm. Emma stood by Margaret's window, tracing the raindrops as they slid down the glass. The air inside the room was heavy with lavender and something faintly metallic, the scent of age and memory. Margaret sat in her chair again, the same shawl around her shoulders, a wooden box resting on her lap. When she opened it, a faint sigh escaped her lips, like exhaling the weight of 50 years. You asked who my mother was, she said softly. It's time you saw for yourself. Inside the box lay a neat stack of envelopes, yellowed photographs, and a small leather-bound journal tied with ribbon. Margaret lifted one of the photographs and handed it to Emma. Catherine stood in a garden, smiling for the camera, sunlight catching the lace of her dress. Her beauty was effortless, radiant, but her eyes betrayed her again, that same quiet sadness Emma had seen in every picture. She looks, Emma searched for the right word. Lonely, Margaret finished. She always did. Even when she smiled, it never reached her eyes. Emma stared at the photo longer than she meant to. She looks like she's waiting for something that never came. Margaret nodded slowly. She was. For most of her life. Margaret untied the ribbon around the journal and flipped it open. The handwriting was graceful, looping, each line careful, as though Catherine had believed even her pain needed to be beautiful. She wrote everything down, Margaret said. Every thought she couldn't say out loud. Emma leaned closer. On the first page, in faded ink, was written, June 20th, 1957. The house smells of roses and regret. The next page read, He kissed my hand this morning and called me lucky. I wanted to tell him I was terrified. I wanted to tell him that love shouldn't feel like suffocation dressed as silk. Emma's chest tightened. Another entry. I dreamed of Daniel again last night. He was painting by the sea. He said, it isn't too late. But I woke up to Robert's alarm clock. It's always too late when the sun rises. She closed the book, hands trembling. She wrote like she knew someone would read it someday. Margaret smiled faintly. Maybe she hoped someone would understand her better than anyone did back then. Margaret reached into the box again and pulled out a folded piece of ivory fabric. Even after all these years, it shimmered faintly in the dim light. The dress, she said softly. My mother's pride and punishment. Emma froze. You kept it. I couldn't throw it away, Margaret said, eyes distant. After she died, my father insisted I wear it for my own wedding. Said it would be a way to honor her. She laughed, the sound brittle. I refused. I couldn't bear the thought of walking into the same kind of cage. So it was stored away all these years, Emma said, realization dawning. Until the estate sale. Yes. Margaret's fingers grazed the fabric. It was supposed to be mine. But I couldn't touch it without remembering her tears the night before her wedding. Emma stared at the fabric, heart pounding. You said the letter was for your wedding day. Margaret nodded. She wrote it hoping I'd be braver than she was. But I wasn't. I stayed in my marriage far too long. A silence stretched between them. Emma finally whispered, maybe she meant for it to find someone else, someone who still had time. Margaret's eyes softened. Then perhaps it found the right woman after all. Emma sat quietly, staring at Catherine's handwriting, the photos, the relics of a woman who had lived the same life she herself was drifting into. I thought my wedding was supposed to be the happiest time of my life, she said. But lately, it feels like I'm watching someone else live it for me. Margaret reached across the table, her frail hand resting on Emma's. That's how it begins. You tell yourself it's just nerves, just compromise. You convince yourself love should feel safe, not wild. But one morning, you wake up and realize you've gone quiet inside. Emma's throat tightened. That's exactly how it feels. Margaret's gaze was kind, but unwavering. Then don't make the same mistake. Don't build a life around other people's expectations and call it love. Emma's voice cracked. But what if I've already gone too far? Margaret smiled faintly. It's never too late to be honest, unless you wait until you can't speak anymore. Margaret handed her one last photo. It was small, frayed at the edges, a candid shot of Catherine standing on a pier, wind tugging at her hair. She looks alive there, Emma whispered. That was taken by Daniel, Margaret said. The week before she married Robert. My father never knew she kept it. Emma turned it over. On the back, in delicate script, were the words. Love is not quiet. Remember that. The room went still. Emma traced the writing with her fingertip, her heart hammering. She could almost feel Catherine's voice inside those words, the echo of a warning passed through generations. Margaret watched her carefully. You see it now, don't you? Emma nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I see everything. They sat in silence, two women bound by one story, one who had lived it, one who was about to. Outside, the storm clouds thinned, letting weak sunlight spill across the floor. It caught the lace of the dress and made it shimmer like something alive. Margaret's eyes followed the light. Do you still have the gown? Yes. Then promise me something. Emma looked up. What? When you wear it again, Margaret said softly, make sure you're walking toward your own choice. Not anyone else's. Emma nodded slowly, though her chest felt tight with uncertainty. I will. Margaret smiled, but her eyes were distant, sad. Good. Because I think your fiancé already knows more about this story than he's telling you. Emma froze. What do you mean? Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. James Turner isn't just Robert's grandson, Emma. He's also Daniel Rose. The words struck like a thunderclap, impossible, disorienting. Emma's breath caught. What? Margaret nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. My mother's two worlds didn't stay separate forever. They collided, and you're standing in the wreckage of both. For a long moment, the only sound in Margaret's room was the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall, steady, unbothered, as if it had been keeping time for every secret ever whispered inside these walls. Emma sat frozen in her chair, trying to process what she'd just heard. James wasn't just Robert's grandson. He was Daniel Rose too. Two bloodlines tangled by one woman's silence. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her breath shallow, her voice steady but distant. When my mother died, she began, I thought I'd buried her story with her. But the truth doesn't stay buried, Emma. It waits. It grows restless. She turned her gaze to the window, where the late afternoon light was fading into amber. Robert Moore was my father. But Daniel Rowe, he was my mother's heart. Emma swallowed hard. You mean? Margaret nodded slowly. She never said it out loud, but I always knew. I didn't have to be told. Children can sense when love is missing, and when it's hiding somewhere else. The words hung between them like a confession decades overdue. She stayed with Robert, Margaret continued, but Daniel never stopped trying to reach her. From the box on the table, Margaret lifted another small bundle of envelopes, tied together with a piece of worn blue ribbon. They came every month for years, she said softly. He wrote her from New York first, then from Paris, later from London. Always the same handwriting. Always the same return address, one that kept changing as he moved. She never answered. Emma leaned forward. You have them? Margaret nodded. I found them after she died. Hidden beneath the false bottom of her jewelry box. Every letter unopened. Her voice trembled. She couldn't bring herself to destroy them, but she couldn't bear to read them either. She handed the bundle to Emma. The paper was brittle beneath her fingers, the ribbon stained darker where tears might once have fallen. Read one, Margaret said. Emma hesitated. Are you sure? She'd want someone to. Someone who might still learn from it. Emma untied the ribbon carefully. The first letter was dated August 1958, a year after the wedding. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. My dearest Catherine. I saw the announcement. You looked radiant, though not in the way you used to. Radiance without warmth, light without fire. I shouldn't say that. I'm sorry. I only mean that I can't stop thinking about you. I've painted you 100 times, but none of them are right. Every time I start over, I realize the truth. I don't want to capture you. I want to find you. Please, Catherine. Write me. Tell me you're happy, or tell me you're not, but tell me something. Yours, always, Daniel. Emma's eyes stung. Margaret was silent, her gaze fixed somewhere in the past. Emma turned to the next letter. December 1959. Christmas without you again. I keep thinking of the night at the gallery, when you told me the stars looked like secrets the world wasn't ready for. You were right. The world wasn't ready for us. But maybe we were too afraid to make it listen. I'm not angry anymore. I just miss you. Tell me you're safe. Emma closed the envelope, her hands trembling. He loved her his whole life. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes. And she spent hers pretending she didn't love him back. She never wrote to him. Emma asked quietly. No. Not once. Why? Margaret's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. Because she was terrified. She'd built a life around being what everyone wanted her to be. To answer him, to choose him, would have meant tearing it all apart. And she couldn't. She let out a long breath. So she did what women like her were taught to do. She stayed. She smiled. And she kept her heart locked away where no one could see it, not even herself. Emma stared at the letters in her lap, feeling the weight of them like stones. Did he ever stop writing? Yes. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. After 20 years. Emma looked up. 20 years. He wrote until 1977, Margaret said. The year before she died. Margaret handed her one last envelope, its paper thinner than the others, the ink faint. He must have known she was sick, Margaret murmured. It arrived a few weeks before she passed. Emma unfolded it slowly. My Catherine. I've heard rumors, whispers from Charleston that you're unwell. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I can't leave the last word unsaid. You once told me you felt trapped by the walls others built around you. I think I've spent my life building walls of my own, waiting for you to knock them down. I'm not writing to ask you to leave him anymore. I only want you to forgive yourself. You were always braver than you thought. And I loved you, not for who you were to the world, but for who you tried to be when no one was watching. If this letter reaches you, I hope you find peace, wherever you are. Always, Daniel. Emma couldn't speak. Margaret wiped her eyes with a tissue, her voice barely above a whisper. She never opened that one either. Emma set the letter down gently, as if it might break. Did he ever find out she died? No, Margaret said. He died 5 years ago. Heart failure. He was in his 80s. I only learned about it from a small obituary online. She hesitated. He had a son. An only child. The boy took his mother's name after the divorce. Turner. Emma's heart dropped. James. Margaret nodded. It was like the floor had tilted beneath her. The letters blurred in front of her eyes, and she blinked hard to steady them. My fiancé, she whispered. His Daniel's grandson. Yes. And Robert's. Margaret nodded again, slow and deliberate. Both lines came together when Margaret Moore Turner, my daughter, married Daniel's son decades later. The irony of fate, isn't it? My mother's two worlds reunited long after she was gone. Emma felt dizzy. So James is your grandson. Margaret gave a small, sad smile. You could say that. Did he know about this? Margaret's expression darkened. His father never told him. But I think James found out on his own, after he inherited some of Daniel's things. Paintings, letters, maybe even the truth she tried to hide. Emma's thoughts raced. The text messages, the sudden defensiveness, the way he always changed the subject when she mentioned the past. He knew. He'd known before she did. You see it now, don't you? Margaret said softly. You and my mother, you're standing at the same crossroads. Emma nodded, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. I feel like her story is bleeding into mine. It is, Margaret said. Because that dress, that letter, those choices, they all carry echoes. Every woman in my family learned how to be quiet. Maybe you were the one meant to end that. Emma looked down at the lace peeking from the box, the delicate fabric that had outlived its owner. I used to think the dress was beautiful, she said. Now it feels like a ghost. Margaret's voice softened. Beauty can be dangerous when it hides pain. My mother thought if she looked perfect, no one would see how broken she was. Emma exhaled shakily. That's how I feel when I look at myself in my wedding photos. Margaret gave a faint, knowing smile. Then you already have your answer. The light outside had turned orange and dim. Margaret looked exhausted, but her eyes still glimmered with a strange kind of clarity. There's one more thing, she said. Daniel's letters aren't the only things I kept. She opened the bottom drawer of her nightstand and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. I found this among his belongings after he died. It was addressed to Catherine Whitmore Moore, or whoever carries her story. I think that's you now. Emma took it, heart racing. What's inside? Margaret smiled faintly. Maybe the answer she never gave him. Emma hesitated, turning the envelope in her hands. You haven't opened it? Margaret shook her head. It wasn't mine to read. Emma sat there for a moment, staring at the envelope, the faded postmark, the uneven handwriting, the faint scent of dust and old paper. Her fingers trembled as she traced the seal. What if it changes everything? She whispered. Margaret's eyes met hers. Then it's about time something did. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance again, the soft, familiar warning of another storm building. Emma tucked the envelope into her bag, her pulse quickening. I need to go, she said. I have to see James. Margaret nodded, though her expression was uncertain. Be careful. The truth doesn't just set you free, Emma. Sometimes it asks what you're willing to lose for it. Emma paused at the door, glancing back one last time. Margaret looked smaller now, framed by the fading light, holding one of her mother's journals to her chest like a fragile piece of herself. Thank you, Emma whispered. Margaret smiled faintly. Go find out what he knows. Outside, the air had cooled. The clouds had thickened again, swallowing the evening sun. Emma walked briskly toward her car, her bag pressed against her chest, the unopened letter inside it like a heartbeat. As she reached for the door handle, her phone buzzed. A message from James. Don't go to Margaret again. We need to talk first. Tonight. Her fingers froze on the screen. A second message appeared before she could reply. There are things you don't understand, Emma. Things about my grandfather, and yours. The world seemed to narrow to the glow of her phone screen, the words pulsing like warning lights. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Her grandfather? She looked back at the retirement home, a small shape fading into the dark behind her. The storm finally broke overhead, lightning flashing white against the wet pavement. And somewhere deep inside, Emma felt it. The past wasn't finished with her yet. It was just beginning to speak.